Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam.
Alhamdulillahillazi arsala rasulahu bil huda wa dinil haq liyuzhirahu 'ala ad-din kullih wa kafa billahi shahida wa usalli wa usallimu ala rasulihil karim wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. I'm of course very fortunate to be meeting the brothers, sisters, I believe, and must congratulate Institute of Objective Studies with University of Ibn Khaldun, together with IT, to organize a very important and pertinent conference. You see, generally, the Islam in this region, Southeast Asia, and particularly Indonesia, has been somewhat marginalized. There is hardly any study or analysis among even Islamic workers or Islamic movements or contemporary intellectuals on the unique development of Islam in Indonesia for a variety of reasons, from the first period of Islamization to the formative period of Indonesian independence and surfacing of outstanding leaders, political intellectuals such as Mohammad Natsir, that we are having this discourse today. So I think it is of course very timely, and I believe we have a companion of scholars. I see Kamal Hassan here, Pak Yusuf Kala, and a number of others who have actually real direct experience knowing Bapak Muhammad Natsir and also studying him, and some of course followed his journey directly into politics and in Dewan Da'wah Islamiyah Indonesia. I am fortunate because as a young man and as a student at University of Malaya, had the opportunity to attend some conferences, and leaders of HMI those days, the Muslim Students Organization Indonesia, brought me to see as early as 1969, 70, 71, just post confrontasi. You know, in the history of Malaysia and Indonesia, there was a period under Sukarno where he declared virtual war, confrontation against Malaysia, and shortly after that, then we were sent initially as students to meet the radical students of Indonesia. And it's interesting, I was brought to see Almarhum Muhammad Natsir by Fahmi Idris and Eki Shahrudin, I remember very well. Of course, I was thrilled by this personality. Former Prime Minister, a great intellectual, a very known and popular leader who has been in prison and virtually has no position, but you can see stream of supporters who express their devotion and love and affection because of his ideas. And the simplicity of his surroundings, I mean, not much deliberated many places, including the research account. I mean, there are hundreds of books with me here about Natsir, particularly in Indonesia. I must congratulate our scholars in Indonesia who have written, so many accounts on Natsir, and 100 years of Natsir, and a great one, a good one by Luqman Hakim too. So I think I'm not here to compete, except to share some experience of mine, particularly in the realm of ideas and thought, because he's a multifaceted Renaissance man in many ways. He writes prophetically in a very prolific manner in the initial Capital Selector, and this is of course a reprint. Interesting enough, I have the original print by Van Hoof of Holland at that time. And let me summarize using the latest account by Audrey Kahin, the wife of the famous Kahin, when she managed to bring up the reformist ideals of Natsir, consistent from the 30s when he wrote for Pembela Islam and republished under Capital Selecta, which I will of course deal with because this is where the initial ideas being formed and formulated by Natsir. But he was always very strong in his faith and moral values, his adherence to Islam and Islamic ideals, his interpretation of the Quran and the Sunnah Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, understanding, and a great da'i from the beginning. And you know, in the 30s, he was already involved initially with A. Hassan, but what's important is his debate, a very known literary discourse in Pembela Islam, debating on nationalism, on modern Turkey under Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, on the ideas of some modernists in Egypt, like Sheikh Abdul Razak in Al-Islam wal Usul Hukum, about Islam and nation state, which is totally different. I'm not going to enter to that, but to suggest that this has gone through when he was in his 20s, at a very young age, writing prolifically on Islam and modernity, and the need to deepen our understanding from the set of rituals to the relevance of Islam in society and in the nation. I must again commend Professor Diliano, who summarized some of these brilliantly in his modernist Muslim movement of Indonesia, Gerakan Modern Islam Indonesia 1900-1942. Well, you see, I'm getting excited because I love him. This is one of the great, outstanding contemporary leaders that have influenced me personally and Abim when I led. You know, and there was a time when we had great movements in the Middle East, like the Ikhwan or Jamaat Islami, and whilst we benefited immensely from their experiences, I thought from my limited experience and the work in Abim, we were much more influenced by the direction of Indonesia or Indonesian Islam under Masyumi or Muhammad Natsir. Is more inclusive, is accommodate the interests of Islam and Muslims, 90%, but then always take into consideration to try and appreciate, understand, tolerate, include the sentiments of the Hindus, the Buddhists, and the Christians from the very beginning, and very entrenched in cultural sentiments and values. It is Islam, but not dogmatic nationalist, but very nationalistic in the more liberal context, promoting the language, the literature, and that is something which I consider exceptionalism of Muhammad Natsir as an intellectual, a public intellectual, and political leader. Now, the philosopher thinker from France, Roger Garaudi, once said that we show interest and affection for the great leaders. It is not enough to bury the ashes of the dead, but to rekindle its flame. That's why Manzoor Al-Absab, it is commendable that your team with Ibn Khaldun University and MIT takes the trouble. I mean, it is odd for India to talk about Natsir. I mean, it is something refreshing, you see, and I think it is not usual, you know, and I think it shows your foresight and understanding and appreciating the contribution of all our brothers throughout the world. Now, what strikes me, and this I've said before in some of our earlier seminars, in his Capital Selector, which of course was a text in our days, and his Fiqh al-Da'wah, which we republished. Interesting that Abim, those days, republished many of his works, which I think referred to in this book when I mentioned that Natsir, when talking about development, you see, you must not talk about progress and development and at the same time destroy. What you develop, institutions, buildings, structures, industries. What you destroy, morality. There's oppression of workers. There is complete neglect, in the sense, to allow for grinding poverty and gross inequality, to use this more popular parlance of today. But he thought of it long before this became narrative in intellectual circles as we observe at present. Now, I wanted to quote Kahin because there is a time when there was when Natsir was involved in this petition of 50 leaders and scholars, and therefore he was barred. He was completely not only marginalized but denied any opportunity to serve as a normal citizen in Indonesia. But his consistent message from the 30s to the 80s, when he criticized Muslim societies, including Indonesia, where its upper strata have become grossly materialistic, selfish, and shorn of social conscience, with this development being accompanied by a widening gap between the rich and the poor. This was originally from George Kahin in memoriam of Mohammad Natsir, and here referred to by Audrey Kahin, Islam, Nationalism and Democracy, a political biography of Mohammad Natsir, quite a recent publication. I think it's about 2012. Now, I mentioned earlier an example, a striking example, other than the debate on nationalism, asabiyah, what is allowed, what is disallowed, which was debated in the 30s and sometimes until the present, causing confusion among our intellectuals. And this obsession or admiration for so-called modern Turkey at the expense of their identity and their Islamicity. This was also debated in the 30s. And it's interesting enough, this was between Sukarno, who was enchanted by modern Turkey, and Natsir, who actually cautioned against this adulation without looking at the substance. So in the terms of the realm of ideas, I would refer to a name which is, I should say, unheard of in this region, or in Asia for that matter. Natsir in Capital Selector suddenly introduced a name, a Belgian historian, Henry Pirenne. Now, nobody talks about it. There was no reference. I asked many scholars of historiography just whether they made references. Hardly any. Now, of course, he at length he quoted and debated on Snook Hugronje, who wrote the 2 volumes, The Achenes and Mecca, in the later part of the 19th century, which was a thesis on the Dutch, that prompted later the Dutch ethical policy to secularize Indonesia. And the issue of secularization was discussed in his debate with Sukarno, and Hugronje came to mind. But then he introduced the name Henry Pirenne. It's interesting when I was in Washington DC. I made sure that our brother Jamal Bazanji ordered as many books as possible by Henry Pirenne, which is not known among the intellectual circles in Washington, Muhammad and Chalaman, and A History of Europe. Now, what is the Pirenne thesis? The Pirenne thesis states somewhat clearly that the point of departure between the old culture or civilization and the new modern civilization must be in terms of values and ideas, modernity. And that is why in this book, Muhammad and Chalaman shows proof, sent a very fundamental message about the critical date or time where we can determine the state, the new modern state of affairs. Only with Muhammad, in this battle, Islam and Chalaman at that time, Charles Martel and Chalaman then, only with the advent of Islam, Europe understands modernity. And this was actually, in terms of history and understanding of society, is a tour de force. Now, 10 years later, probably 30 years later, our great sociologist, scholar, thinker, Hossein Al-Attas, who's very known for his works like Myth of the Lazy Native and also Intellectuals in Living Societies, in his paper to the Conference of Asian Historians in 1960, mentioned this Henry Pirenne. Okay? And as you know, Hussein was associated with Natsir in Bogor or Bandung in their constituency debate on the constitution for before the independence of Indonesia. And he said modern Malaysia must not be seen by or determined by the printing or advent of the British, but advent of ideas. And finally, in 71, his brother, Professor Naqib Al-Attas, also one of my sheikhs, then wrote Islam in the History of Malay Culture and Society, where he made reference again to the Pirenne thesis. You can imagine. This was the beginning was in Capita Selecta, okay, where he wrote in the 1930s. And it became a tour de force in the entire study of Islam and Malay Indonesian society in the 60s and the 70s, and these two texts still become quite pillars in terms of intellectual advancement. So it's very interesting here to see the relevance of his ideas and thinking. Of course, he elaborates about Islam in his role as in Dewan Da'wah, for example. It's clear the understanding of Islam, the faith, moral values, anti-corruption drive. He got into lots of trouble because of his strong disagreement about against corruption. So when we talk about Natsir, to my mind, I think we need to talk about or focus on his ideas for societal reform, for the understanding of history and society, and the need for Islah in our society. When he talks about development, he talks about progress, he talks about education, or issues of governance. This central pillar of Islam and ethics, anti-corruption, and inclusivity. Of course, here in Malaysia, where we felt it is more pressing because the nature that Muslims come to about 60%. Now, here was a country that he represents 90% Muslims, but he made it very clear, the clarion call to be in the cause of humanity, in the cause of freedom, and very strong Democrat. And I should say that in modern and contemporary society, he was a great Muslim Democrat, must say. That I think I would end at that, because this subject happens to be my focus, or I probably follow. My Indonesian friends know that any book, any article published on Indonesian Islam or Natsir, that I make sure that it's available on my desk. And here in our society, there was a big event in commemoration of his 100 years of Natsir. His books are being published. Some, other than what I said about Indonesia, some of the works are of course published here. Too many of them, but I want just to show that mainly ABIM and the universities here have taken lots of interest in this study, understanding of this great Indonesian and a great Muslim. I must again thank you very much for this opportunity. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you, Dr. Shahid Dr. Anwar Ibrahim, former Deputy Prime Minister of Malaysia. I believe that with the very authenticated references